to Springboard episode 19. I am one of the hosts of Springboard here. I am with my co-host here, Jeff. My name's Jonathan. And we haven't done a Springboard for a couple weeks now. So hopefully some people have been anticipating this, excited for this to come out. But it's nice to see you over Zoom, Jeff, once again, getting used to this side-by-side look we have going here. So
you're getting used to it because it's taking a little longer for me.
Yeah, maybe I'm getting used to it, that I've just accepted that this is reality. And don't know if it's the best, but it's good that we can still have these conversations.
Absolutely.
So we haven't talked about the sermon for the last few weeks, and it's obviously been a significant with Passion Week and now Easter weekend coming. So I wanted to just start us with the conversation going back to Palm Sunday a little bit. Might feel like a while ago for people, but we really see Easter not just in isolation, but in this grander narrative leading up to it. And Jeff, I just wanted to start by throwing out the question of what does Palm Sunday and the start of Passion Week, what does that build up to Easter? Like, if we just get Easter without Palm Sunday, what are we missing in a sense?
Well, in a sense, you need to even go back one more step, and this is why we celebrate Lent. It's not because we're participating in some other religion's kind of
dieting
ritual or whatever. Lent is a reminder that there is a journey to the cross. That the cross isn't just this one-off event, but all of the life of Jesus was essentially leading to the cross. Most of the Gospels have some sort of nod towards this. The Gospel of Mark is actually the clearest, where there is this indication in Caesarea Philippi that Jesus is actually beginning a journey from the most northern part of Israel all the way down to Jerusalem, on this journey of helping his disciples understand who he really is. If you remember that conversation where the disciples say, or he says to his disciples, "Who do people say I am?" And then, "Who do you say I am?" And when Peter gets the answer right, technically, "You're the Christ," he then proceeds to start helping them understand what kind of Christ he is. And so this relates directly to Palm Sunday, because Palm Sunday is all about Jesus demonstrating that he's a different kind of king.
Right. Yeah. So how does he do that? Just take us through kind of the narrative. He comes on a colt, and there's palm branches and all those things. But how does that show that he's not like other kings or other expected messiahs?
Yeah. Well, riding on a colt is, I think, actually, it's a prophecy from the Old Testament. I'd have to look it up. Someone's probably watching right now saying, "Oh, it's found in," and telling us where it's found in.
Yeah.
But to ride a donkey colt is literally to sit on humility. Like, riding a horse is what kings do. Riding on a donkey is just saying the very opposite of that. So he already begins with the visual, the image, is being completely opposite or standing on its head of what it should have been. Palm branches, interestingly enough, are only mentioned in John. The other Gospels don't have the word. In fact, I think the word palm is only found in the Gospel of John in the whole New Testament. And so here again, there's this idea that they're laying their coats, their shirts, their palm branches before this king, and singing hosannas. And ultimately, this crowd becomes the same crowd that shouts "Crucify him" a few days later. Not because they were ultimately disappointed in him in all those other ways. It was simply because that he didn't do what they thought that the Messiah would come to do, which is ride in on a horse and kick out Rome.
I think that's some of the tension here that is so fascinating. Just that these are the people that said that just days later. It's so easy for us to read, and I even up to this point, I have to like check myself that when I read this isn't just a bunch of Christians who have had personal relationships with Jesus, all going, "There's Jesus, and here he comes." Like these are people who are in this swirl of like, we think we know who this person is. He's a teacher, he's a rabbi, he's done miracles. Some people say he's this, some people say he's, a prophet reincarnated or something. Like there's all sorts of conversations going on and political dynamics. And he's coming in this way, yeah, humiliating kind of the emperors of the day that would come in on a big horse and all, like you're saying, with a military presence. He doesn't have that.
Yeah.
So there's this confusion going on to them. And we see it now in light of the cross, but they didn't know the cross was just, days away. They yeah, you just wonder what's on the mind of these people. And I think it shows the significance and the complexity of who Jesus says that he is. That back then there was so much going on, and he was really uprooting so much in what he was doing.
Absolutely. And this, along with other kinds of controversial things like healing people on the Sabbath, is ultimately what got him killed. This is what the religious leaders just could not handle in the end. This bold move to not challenge Rome, but to challenge the religious institution of how they are managing the temple and how they're leading God's people. That was just too much for them to handle. And this relates. This is kind of why I felt good about preaching John 13 on Palm Sunday. They're not the same texts. John 13 is talking about Jesus gathering with his disciples around a table and having dinner. And so it's not a Palm Sunday text so much as it is a Passover text, even though I would argue that what's not happening is Passover meal. I think this is a meal before Passover. In fact, that's exactly what John says it is. Mm-hmm. And so it's just an ordinary meal. It could have been Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday before the Passover event, because in John, the Passover meal is not something that the disciples ate around the table in the upper room. The Passover meal is Jesus himself, because John's writing a different story. Everything is metaphor for him, and so he's trying to draw us to Jesus as being our meal and not the meal that's actually at the table. But what happens at this event, this John 13 event, was that Jesus, after supper, stoops down and washes his disciples' feet, which is another connection, I think, to the Palm Sunday imagery of Jesus not being like the Messiah that they expected.
Wow. Yeah. So these stories we get through all the Gospels, but as we've looked at John in this Living Water series, it's like these glimpses, these ideas of I'm different, I'm not the Messiah that you're expecting. And how is that so? You use the word humility, service, servant, leadership, phrases like that there's this idea of he's turning it on its head. And the disciples were just putting the pieces in front of them as they were going through their life, with Jesus, of going, man, he's doing stuff that we weren't expecting. And it's this beautiful progression up to now, the Easter weekend, we see the death and resurrection. And you talked about, for your sermon for Easter, was this idea that resurrection changes us. And it's really the greatest example, or the richest, fullest example of these washing feet kind of stories, that he's turning the Messiahship on its head by washing his disciples' feet. And they go, wow, what is he doing? This is crazy. And it's almost like, just wait till what will happen later, because it's the greatest example of that. Which I think, that's why when we think of the cross, we need to think of the whole of the Gospels, and really the whole of the biblical narrative and the whole of the human story to realize the significance of it, that Jesus is really turning some things over.
Yeah, and he's quite consistent. I mean, these things are not like, wow, Jesus washed his disciples' feet. I mean, yeah, I guess that is a fairly big wow, but it is consistent with everything else that Jesus did. with his life and ultimately with his death. Is there's this line, I didn't spend much time on it, or maybe even any time on it in my sermon on Palm Sunday, but there's this line at the end of that story in John 13 where Jesus says, "A servant is not greater than his master."
Mm-hmm.
And it can seem kind of puzzling at first, like why does Jesus make a hierarchical kind of statement?
Isn't he breaking those down? Like, what's he doing? Yeah.
Right. And he's literally actually telling his disciples, you're my disciple. Like, I'm your master. That's true.
Right.
So whatever I do, you can't say, as one of my followers, you can't say, I'm not going to do that, because that means that you would be greater than me.
Mm.
So if I'm going to wash my disciples' feet and you're not greater than me, you have to, you can't refuse that. You have to copy me, right?
Mm.
So literally Jesus is lowering that bar completely to the ground level, saying, look, if I'm on top, if no one is greater than me, then everybody has to do what I do. And if I do the lowest thing, then everybody's got to do the lowest thing. And so it's a commission. I'm not sure if we're supposed to wash each other's feet in the church as a ritual, like we do, baptism, Lord's Supper kind of stuff. I speculated about that a little bit in my sermon. I don't know if you grew up with foot washing at all in your church.
Yeah, I think it was a youth group thing at some point. But yeah, I've heard people that are like all for it, and people that I think it's one of those things that it's just kind of more of a funny argument. But the symbol of it, absolutely. We don't wear sandals all day anymore. So our feet aren't necessarily as dirty, but they certainly are still dirty. So it doesn't have no significance now. I think it's just, yeah.
Well, and if the supper was done properly that night, their feet had already been cleaned, which means that Jesus actually washed clean feet.
Right.
To me, John's pointing us to a deeper meaning of being servants, of giving our life away, which is just a fantastic little foreshadowing of how Jesus gives his life away within a few days' time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So when we hear those stories, we see how Jesus models it for us, and then he ultimately models this self-sacrificial love, this servant leadership, by dying on a cross and being crucified, and for all of humanity, that it wasn't an exclusive thing, but that he opens this free gift of salvation and healing into people's lives through this act and this resurrection of life that he has. And so I guess what I'm framing is, we see how he acts in the Gospels when he hangs out with the woman at the well and talks with someone who others wouldn't talk with, and he washes feet of the people that are following him, humbling himself. But so we can follow those examples, but what do we do? How does the resurrection change us personally and practically? If we're not all going to die on crosses. We have that that idea of taking up our cross. But what do we do with that? How does it change us? How do you actively see that playing a part in our lives today?
Yeah, I love watching the disciples, the stories of the disciples, no matter what gospel, deal with resurrection. Because even though there was, Jesus taught to some degree, or at least he tried to be as explicit as he could, that he was going to rise on the third day kind of thing. He made that explicit in his teaching. And there was some general Jewish theological framework for resurrection.
Mm-hmm.
When all of a sudden comes true, it still throws all of them into some sort of cognitive dissonance. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what happened here? I can't make sense of this. I can't wrap my mind around it, even though Jesus literally told them what was going to happen. And it just it reminds me that, we can show up. I mean, we're not showing up anymore, but we can show up to our church buildings and sit in our pews and listen to sermons. And it's like these words are pouring over our minds and our hearts, but But then when something would actually happen that we've actually taught explicitly about, we can still go, really? I didn't expect that. And me as a preacher, I just want to say, well, I actually told you like time and time again. And I think it's because we often listen on some sort of autopilot.
Right.
We don't show up with a truly open heart and mind, whether that's to a sermon or listening to a podcast or whatever you're, looking at and reading a book. We're hoping that the author, the speaker, is somehow going to say things that reaffirms what we've always believed. And to show up to something with a truly open heart and mind to say, I want you to open my world. I want you to open up the box and show me something that's completely different, that is God inspired. We don't normally do that. And I teach at CBC, and I know that this is actually how students arrive. It's rare to have a student who sits in class who honestly is looking for you to show them something that they've never seen before. They actually want to hear it's our human instinct. It's not a bad thing. I'm not trying to paint a bad picture of people. It's a human instinct to want to hear something that we already know, because that keeps us steady and stable. And if we hear something that we've just never heard before, and we try to actually wrap our minds around that, it can kind of shake our world a little bit. It can destabilize things. And so even though I think the disciples sort of knew about resurrection, I think ultimately it shook their world.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. It says a lot about what it means to believe something.
Yeah.
Because we might tell people, you've heard the sermon a million times or in Sunday school, this is what I believe. These are the things I believe. But from this story and just knowing what humans are like, the way we act ultimately tells us what we believe. I remember this example of a speaker, I think it was at CBC in a chapel, talking about faith, and he talked about, like, you have faith every day when you sit in a chair. He used that classic kind of example. Yeah. But there's some sense that we believe that the chair will hold us, so we act upon that belief. But when you hear something, you might say, oh, sure, the disciples said, yeah, he said something about, being raised on the third day and this whole resurrection thing. But they had no opportunity necessarily to act on that until it happened. And then that's where the uncertainty and the cognitive dissonance comes of, like, do I actually believe this? Because it's now trying to do something within me. It's telling me to change. And that's what transformational living is. And I think in some sense, all humans want that. We all want to be better. We want a fuller, better, richer life. But we don't always accept the vulnerability, the uncertainty, the sting maybe of knowing that we have to change something. And that means, okay, acting in a step of faith of, I don't know if I actually believe this or what. That's what the disciples did. I think Paul had that as he's writing these letters. They believed the resurrection happened, but it was probably shaking them at their core all the time.
Yeah. And I really like the way that you put that too, because they didn't have an opportunity to put it into practice. How often do we hear something and we kind of hold it for the moment for which maybe we think it is meant for, instead of putting it into practice so that we can develop that sort of sense or skill or knowledge, so that we're prepared for when it happens. Right. I don't know, let's say prayer, preach and teach on the value of praying as a discipline. And so if people don't do that, and then all of a sudden in a year from now, their life turns into major crisis mode, and they're like, oh yeah, prayer, and they actually don't even know how to plug that in. How am I supposed to do this? But if they had been practicing all the while, something would be a little bit more natural there in connecting. I'm not sure if that's the best illustration, but what I'm trying to get at is, somehow if the disciples could have practiced this idea of resurrection, I don't know how you do that, but they could have been more prepared for it when it actually happened to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly enough, they should have been at least a little bit prepared, at least in the Gospel of John, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead.
Right. Yeah.
But somehow that still didn't help them connect the dots.
Yeah. No, and sometimes we look at that and we go, how could they not see it? But I imagine we would all be there right with them,
Yeah.
not fully putting all the pieces together. But so this conversation makes me think of what you said in your sermon about, and you touched on a little bit on this. You use this idea of a box, and you talked about our beliefs and liking to have things reaffirmed, because you kind of build a belief system, and if it's in this box, you put things in it and it's being affirmed, so the walls are getting stronger, it's becoming more secure, and then something comes and throws it off, and that doesn't always feel good. But I don't know, maybe this is a pointed question, but do you think Christians should be people who live without a box, using that analogy, putting boxes together of belief systems and tearing them down and rebuilding them constantly, slowly building them? Like, take that analogy as far as it will go before it becomes chaotic. What do you think is the best way for us to approach creating a kind of a belief system and reaffirming our beliefs, and what you kind of meant by that, and some of the hindrances that can have? You talked about putting God in a box. Yeah, it obviously has negative effects.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those topics that we need to talk about attention to some degree. You preach it one way on one Sunday because you want to make a point, and hopefully you're not setting up sort of like a straw man kind of thing, because I clearly remember when I was off to seminary, my pastor told me, he said, "Jeff, just remember that in Bible college, the whole job for teachers at the Bible college is to help you build boxes, and the whole job at seminary is the professors are there to help you blow all those boxes apart." And I didn't know what he meant, of course, until I went to seminary, and some people experience this at Bible college, so that's fine. He was trying to draw, sort of a scenario, but the idea is that there are times where we actually need to construct our understandings, our framework, our worldview, how we understand the Bible, and to construct those and to make boxes, I guess, is the visual we're using, I think is healthy. It's good. We need some framework to live our lives, and our doctrines can be envisioned this way. Our teachings, our confessions, those kinds of things. Not everything should just be up in the air all the time. Like that's not a way to live. Mm. But when we are so closed after we have built these things that there's nothing else that can happen now God is restricted to the way that we've constructed this framework, that's when it's unhealthy. And so open boxes maybe is a better visual. I'm gonna put these things in the box, but God, if you need to expand this box or take things out or put more things in, I'm fine with that. So the metaphor maybe can be used in a variety of ways. I was using it in a negative way in the sermon. So to help people realize that when we kind of use those words never or always, or we tell people, or we talk about people as though nothing can change. This is always going to be like this. That can never happen. This is impossible. This is the box that I think resurrection just completely blows away and says, you can't do that to God. At seminary, I had, this was 15 years ago, I had a fellow student who wrote a paper called, I think it was called God on the Loose. And it was an entire paper devoted to the curtain in the temple being torn in two. And she wrote it as though the Holy of Holies was the box that Israel was keeping God in. And God finally tore that curtain because he wanted to tell the people, you can't keep me in a box. I'm going to be out on the loose now. And that's going to feel dangerous to you, and it's going to destabilize your little world. but you need to see me as a bigger force or a bigger energy or a bigger spirit than something that you can put in a room and lock the door.
Mm.
Uh,
See, I think that's exactly what I was thinking, is that kind of idea of this analogy, that you're maybe taking down the box, or resurrection or some big idea is destroying the box, not because the box was bad and you don't never need to build a box, but because you need a bigger one. That this Christian journey of you know getting deeper knowledge of who God is and experiencing God and the world and how He's working in this world. You might put it in a box because this is how you've experienced it and it makes sense. When you're 7, but you're going to need a different box when you're 14 and when you're 18 and when you're 30. And maybe the sad thing is, what age do people hit where they've thought, this is the box I need? I finally have arrived.
right.
I have the perfect box. And for some people, that can be when you're 10. And for some people, that's you go to Bible college and you go, yep, got all the answers. And now you have the perfect box. And so I think when it might have this negative connotation of, yes, destroy the box, you have to get rid of it. But if it's because you're getting a deeper understanding of who God is, and you're imagining this world of a God who, with creative love, that loves unconditionally, that loves the least of these, that loves people that you never thought you could love, and can actually affect you, that the Spirit can lead you to places where you're loving people and empathizing with people and caring for others, and being a servant leader, when you want to just be a leader who has authority, and it's so frustrating sometimes, like all these things in life, that when you see God tearing those things down and building a greater world around you, of course, yeah, you can't put that in a box. So I think it's the perspective shift, of kind of saying, my questions and doubts and uncertainties are going to lead to a deeper understanding of God. Is not necessarily to get rid of God altogether or any sort of belief system. If that
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, like, I don't know, I have a box at home. In fact, it's a milk crate. It's a wooden box that my dad had when he was a kid, and he passed it off to me. And I use it to put all my treasures in. So all of the stuff when I was a kid and that kind of stuff, I kind of lock up in this box at home. And every once in a while, I open up the box and I go through it. I look at my report cards when I was a kid, little toys that I had, and those kinds of things. These are all my treasures, little pictures I drew. And I remember the good old days, and that somehow sort of stabilizes things for me. It tells me who I am and all those kinds of things. But every once in a while, I need to put something else in that box because I am a different person. I am growing. I am developing, and I want to make sure that my treasures represent all of my life, not just that one time in my life for nostalgia or reasons, kind of thing. And I think theologically, or even practically in the church, these boxes represent what stabilizes us, what grounds us, the things that we affirm, the things that we know to be true, and we should review them, and we should look through them, and we should constantly be holding them with an open hand, not because we want to throw things up in the air, but because we actually believe in a God who changes things. And so, oh no, that's dead, that's done. No, actually, we believe in the God who specializes in bringing dead things back to life. And so we always need to have that open mind of, yeah, but I know that that's normally what would happen in this situation, but there's God, and we have to leave space for God to do things. Otherwise, we're deists, and we just believe that God is that ancient, old man up in the sky who doesn't really care about what's going on earth right now. But we don't believe that. We actually believe God is involved and present and active in our lives. And so we have to leave space for that.
Yeah, I hear that this talk of belief and faith, what you're saying to me kind of expands that maybe faith and belief isn't so much just the certainty that God will do these things, but just the acceptance and trust and openness to say, okay, God, I don't know how you're going to do that, but I've seen you do things before, and I hear these stories, and you resurrected from the dead, so let's see what will happen. And that sort of faith, which I think is much more, to me, real. That's where I said it at all the times. I don't know, maybe there's some people that don't have any doubts, but it's very human to doubt, and I feel that all the time. But you remember those stories of moments. Obviously, the Easter weekend and this grand resurrection of our Messiah and Christ coming back to life. But then those little resurrections. I like how you phrase that he death to life is the whole thing. That's the grand story, but you see that in little places, in relationships that have been dead for years, family members who haven't talked for years, and slowly peacemaking happening in those conflicts, world conflicts, where you see brokenness and massive corruption in the world, and slowly seeing love enter into that and peace enter into that. That God is in the habit of doing those kind of things, and if we're not seeing those things and we're not participating in them, of course, it'll be hard to believe they're happening, and you can become a pessimist and see no good happening in the world. But I think starting with that posture of, God, I believe you do those things. I don't always know how, and there's some stories that seem too far gone, but I'm not going to put you in that box. I'm just going to see what happens. I think that's a great place to begin.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit in my sermon about how Jesus being raised from the dead. I mean, we can't prove that. There's nothing we can actually do to prove it. And so you said, I don't know if everybody has doubts. I think that everybody has doubts, and if you don't, you're actually not doing any kind of reflection. Because if you reflect on it, you will wrestle with the truth, because we can't prove it. If we could prove it, everything would be different. But we can't prove it, and it's meant to be received by faith. And so doubts are just a natural part of that, and it actually puts us in this privileged position, I think, to assess, to look at it, to reflect, and then to say, I think that this is the most plausible explanation for life. And after you've done that, you can enter. This is maybe what I was getting at a little bit with, it changes the way that we see, because we can see things in this world in a very natural way, cause and effect, all of the laws of physics and so on and so forth. That's one way of seeing. Another way of seeing is God can do something extraordinary in this moment. And so if we believe in resurrection, we actually believe, we believe in a different way of looking at the world and looking at people. And I think that's a privilege. I think that is the best way of viewing the world.
Absolutely. I think that's a great encouragement, and a great way to take the resurrection into our whole life. If this is something that transforms everything in the way we see the world, and know who God is, and act and love other people. You hear it all the time. Easter is not just this weekend, but this is 365. It's every day of our life as Christians to live this out. And it can be cheesy, but I think there's absolute truth to that we should be looking for resurrection in all things. Where can we see redemption and reconciliation happening? And may God give us eyes to see that we can see what happened on the cross, and we can then look inward towards our own lives and then into the world around us and go, God, where are you resurrecting the dead? Not necessarily literally, but what are dead things that are coming to life? And let me participate in that. Let me join in on that. And that's the Christian mission. And I think in a really beautiful way that's not just disconnected from the cross, but it's absolutely intertwined into how we see Easter. So
Absolutely.
I think that's great. Well, yeah, I think that wraps up our conversation here on episode 19. Thanks for listening or watching. If you're watching as well, next week we are wrapping up our series on living water. So we have one more. Pastor Carey's going to be preaching out of John 21, just the story of Jesus coming back to the disciples and having breakfast, and eating some fish over a fire. And Carey wants us to be thinking about smells. So I want to add to another sense. Right now you're hearing my voice and you might be seeing my face, but think about smells in our life. I think he's been touching on that idea with this story. So take what you will with that. But thanks for listening, everyone. And we look forward to the next episode.
Bye, everyone.
See ya.